ourselves, our communities, our kin. We invite you to take a moment now to recognize whose lands and whose water you are currently in relation with. Land acknowledgements are intended in part to be unsettling for settlers, and we suggest to turn those feelings of unease into action. Volunteering for local Indigenous land protection groups, donating to organizations, helping create equity, pushing the Canadian government to acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty are a few of the many ways to transform guilt or unease into strong acts of allyship. How can we together and as individuals honor those who are to come and those who have gone before as our bodies hold space here? So tonight we are coming together for the launch of Samir Shaheen-Hussein's Fighting for a Hand to Hold. We've put together a panel of researchers, activists, and community sector workers to speak to issues of medical colonialism, disparities in Indigenous people's health and social well-being, and Indigenous resistance to the medical establishment. Using government documentation, historical scholarship, media reports, public inquiries, and personal testimonies, Fighting for a Hand to Hold exposes the medical establishment's role in the colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The book examines the anti-Indigenous racism that is embedded in the Canadian public healthcare system and calls for reparations, restitution, including land reclamation, and self-determination for Indigenous peoples. Before I introduce our moderator for tonight, Rafe will be making an announcement for an upcoming event.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. My name is Raif Haddad, and I'm speaking on behalf of McGill Science Undergrad Society Social Sustainability Committee. The SSC is responsible for enforcing inclusivity and promoting cultural diversity. The committee reaches its goals by creating events to raise awareness about such social injustice and supporting equality. For this month of December, we are holding a month-long fundraiser initiative under the name of Making Spirits Bright, supporting your local Montreal-based organization, Welcome Collective. The fundraiser will be run as a raffle that will feature many prizes, including gift cards and gift baskets. Welcome Collective has been and still supports refugees' families by providing furniture, winter clothing, kitchen supplies, and many other goods and services. This November, on the 30th, we will be launching our fundraiser as a part of our webinar, Disparities in Healthcare. Please check our Facebook page at SUS Social Sustainability for webinar registration and information. The event, of course, is open for public, and we'll be raising donation, peer registration out of your generosity, and whoever participates gets a ticket for the raffle. I would like to thank you in advance for your generous donation, and from me and from SUS family, we are very excited to be a part of this event tonight. Without further ado, I would like to pass it to my panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rafe. The moderator for tonight is Jessica Quijano. She is a mother of two, activist, community harm reduction worker. She has been involved in the feminist movement for 20 years, a community worker for 17, and currently is the coordinator of the Iskweu project at the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. The Iskweu project aims at eradicating the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, trans, and Two-Spirit in Quebec. Welcome, Jessica.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I have my dog. It's just easier. He wants attention. I'm so pleased to be here. As someone who works with the Indigenous community, mainly the homeless Indigenous community, with the women living in poverty, I see just the effects of them being denied medical care on a regular basis, and how it really contributes to women being more marginalized, being put in more dangerous situations, and just experiencing so much more violence overall in their entire life. So I'm really interested to hear about your book, Samir, and as well talk to the panelists to get their ideas on how we can address this really important social issue. So I guess I'm going to hand it to I'm really looking forward to speaking to Ellen and Carrie and Wanda and Richard, and hearing all your thoughts about this issue. I'm gonna hand over to Samir, if you want to go ahead and introduce your work.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Hopefully this works because my internet sometimes acts up. 2 seconds. Perfect. Can someone just by text in the chat, just let me know that they can see the screen? Because I can't see faces anymore. Perfect. So thank you again, Jessica, for the introduction. Thank you, Kelsey, for welcoming. Thanks to QPIRG, Concordia, and QPIRG-McGill for organizing the event, and also to the different other endorsing groups, and of course, thank you to Carrie and Wanda and Ellen and Richard for agreeing to speak on this panel. I kind of feel a bit intimidated with all of you here, but I'm going to try to go over as quickly as I can, just because of time, a few aspects from the book. And then after that, we can hopefully go into a Q&A when I will kind of step back, because everyone else has certainly much more important things to say than I do. So, I mean, I'll just to start, I basically have no disclosure or conflict of interest to declare, except obviously the fact that all of the stuff I'll be talking about comes from the book, but that being said, all the royalties from the book are actually going to be directed to pre-designated organizations in support of Indigenous children, youth, and their communities, and they're all listed on the book's website. But these are the 6 organizations that the book's royalties are going to go to. I also just want to acknowledge that even though it's my name on the cover of the book, you know, Cindy Blackstock wrote the foreword and Ellen Gabriel wrote the afterword to the book, and it's really important for me to highlight that both of their contributions are core parts of the book. They're not add-ons. They're very much a part of the book, and the book should be read as such. So just quickly, in terms of objectives, I just want to go over, do a bit of an overview of the campaign, the Hand to Hold campaign that kind of is used as a case study in the book. Talk about medical colonialism and anti-Indigenous systemic racism in healthcare and how it manifested in the context of the campaign. Show how the medical establishment has played a role in the genocidal colonial project through the violence inflicted on Indigenous children, and also highlight the importance of decolonization initiatives for health and social justice. I mentioned the disclaimers, but I guess the other kind of disclaimer I should say is that I'm coming obviously from a very particular social, political context, I guess, or framework. And this line from Indigenous activists from the 80s in Australia resonates with me significantly. They basically had said, if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And along the same lines, another line that actually significantly inspired the way the campaign was framed is this line by Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a civil rights activist, labor union organizer, feminist, who popularized the quote of "nobody's free until everybody's free." Very quickly, I also just want to acknowledge all the families that spoke out courageously during the campaign itself. the campaign would not have been what it was, obviously, without their involvement. And they were the soul of the campaign. They really spoke out in situations where things were very difficult for them on different levels, and in some cases, bringing back traumatic memories. So very quickly, the context of the campaign, just for people who may not know, is that in Quebec, in the province, there was basically a non-accompaniment rule that had been in place for decades, which basically prevented children from being accompanied by a parent or caregiver when they needed emergency medical care and were being airlifted from rural and remote communities. And that rule was in place, like I said, since at least the 1980s. When Évacuation et Remédicale du Québec, which is the government agency that runs Medevacs, came into existence. And the reasons for the rule are unclear. I say rule and not a policy because there was actually never any written policy. It was just a rule or a practice. And the reason it started, again, we can't know because there was no policy, but the reason it persisted, the excuses that were often given were that there was not enough space on the plane to allow a parent or caregiver, or that they would possibly impact on confidentiality for other patients who are on board, things like that. But this happened in the context where in the rest of Canada, as of the 1990s and after that, all other pediatric centers basically started encouraging caregiver accompaniment. But in Quebec, that did not change. And so this map that's on the screen now is basically a map of the catchment area for the Montreal Children's Hospital. And so as you can see, the red is basically where kids would come to us. And the gray, they would basically go to either Quebec City or Saint-Justine, which is the other pediatric hospital in Montreal. And as you can tell, the top two communities are Nunavik and Io-Ishi, or James Bay Cree territory. So the lands of Iu or Cree and Inuit. And these communities were, for reasons that I unfortunately can't go into, just for sake of time, but these two communities were disproportionately impacted by this practice, even though the rule applied to all kids across the province who needed medevac airlifts on an emergent basis. These two communities were disproportionately impacted. And this is basically the map of AVAC's service and their flight patterns back in 2000 up until 2018. And as you can see, just very briefly, the colored lines are basically where the air shuttle provided coverage, and the air shuttle ran on a daily or every other day basis. Whereas the black is the flying hospital, the Challenger plane, and that provides 24/7 coverage, but that's where the rule, the non-accompaniment rule, applied. And so you can see that in northern Quebec, basically there's no shuttle. And so because on the shuttle, parents and caregivers were allowed on board, in many cases for less urgent emergencies, on those planes, parents were able to come. But again, because there's no shuttle in the north, these kids were not allowed to have a parent or caregiver, even when they were not necessarily critically ill, but still need to be emergently transferred. So as you can imagine, it was obviously a very traumatizing experience for children, many of whom had never flown before, who would basically come on this monstrous plane. Inside, it was very cold and not necessarily particularly welcoming. They were surrounded by strangers. And then when they got down to the hospital, to us, similarly, they were surrounded by a bunch of people who were poking and prodding at them and not speaking their language, a bunch of strangers, and they did not have anyone that they knew with them. And so obviously that brought up issues in terms of clinical care, brought issues in terms of patient safety. It brought up issues in terms of parental consent, of course. And the parents or caregivers were basically forced to take a commercial plane, the next commercial plane available, but sometimes that wouldn't be available for a day, 2 days, sometimes 3 days after because of weather conditions and things like that. So oftentimes these kids were alone for several days before a parent would be able to rejoin them. And so after trying internally and writing a letter to the government, there was no firm commitment that things were going to change. And so basically in January of 2018, healthcare providers at the Montreal Children's Hospital launched a hand-to-hold campaign to put an end to this. The one demand was basically putting an end to this practice. And initially, when the campaign was launched, the health minister at the time was Gaetan Barrette. His initial response was basically that there were no plans on changing anything to allow caregiver accompaniment. And activist, Mi'kmaq activist and lawyer Pamela Palmater writes about the usual techniques of government of deny, defer, and deflect. And this was kind of what we were seeing over and over again during the campaign of what their response was. A few weeks after the launch of the campaign, a bunch of other organizations got on board. There was a tremendous amount of public support, and the Canadian Pediatric Society got on board as well, saying that the practice reinforced racism and that we had to dismantle these colonial systems. So it was kind of heavy words, strong-worded letter that was sent to the government from a very mainstream pediatric organization, which continued to put a lot of pressure on the government. And so basically 3 weeks after the launch of the campaign, there was an announcement made by the health minister that things were going to change in the next few weeks. That didn't happen for the next few weeks. In fact, the next few months, kids continued to be sent unaccompanied, systematically so. But eventually, in June, things did finally change. At the end of June, there was a press release that said that there was now going to be an actual policy that would allow parents and caregivers to be to accompany their kids on the Challenger plane. And so that was very exciting news, obviously, but still we all took it with a certain level of cautious optimism. So this was the first family that actually was allowed to come together. So this child and his mother were the first family that were allowed to travel together on the Challenger plane in early July. And so again, we had hope, but what we were actually seeing was that 50% of kids were still being sent unaccompanied. And in fact, a couple of months later, this child was transferred alone to Saint Justine Hospital from Chibougamau. It's a EU child, a Cree child, and his parents were not allowed to accompany him. And they ended up speaking out, and they also testified at the Vienne Commission in October. And basically around that time, in October of 2018, IVAC finally fully implemented the new framework or policy to make sure that all these kids were accompanied. So as of October 2018, there's only very, very rare cases when kids are sent alone, and it's not usually because of a fault of AVAC. It's for other circumstances that are difficult for families to be able to come right away. And so that's obviously it was great news, and things have changed significantly for these families. It's night and day, also from a medical perspective. But I want to go back to one event that happened during the campaign, and I'm going to share a video. Hopefully it'll work. It's a 2-minute report from the CBC around this time, and they'll explain basically what the issue was. So again, if someone can just make sure, just let me know by chat, just that they can see the screen and they can hear the video that's going to start playing in a second.
A rule that prevented sick children from traveling with their parents aboard medevac flights has been widely criticized in Quebec. After recent pushback, the government yielded and promised to let parents on board. At a community event at this mosque, the health minister was asked why that hasn't happened yet. CBC obtained a recording of his response, where he guaranteed someone intoxicated will be kicked off of a flight in the next 6 months.
Where someone will not be made not allowed to get on the plane. Why? Because no one agitated, drunk, under whatever influence would get on the plane. Any problems. That will not happen. That happens all the time.
Those words led to a chorus of condemnation.
To have comments like that by a minister is totally appalling and unacceptable. We're going to demand that the minister resign from his position.
The head of an organization that represents Inuit in Quebec's north says he needs to apologize, and I don't think that will be enough. He needs to go. The trust is gone. Barrette backpedaled today, at first saying that people wrongly assumed he'd been talking about Indigenous people when he meant it more generally. Then later he offered this as an apology.
I can understand the sensitivity of that and the reaction, and I apologize for that. I'm quite sorry about that, but at the end of the day, can we move on?
The Premier is standing in solidarity with his health minister as a provincial election looms.
I think he's sorry that his words have been interpreted that way. I suggest that we leave it there.
Barrette did call the mayor of Kuujjuaq to apologize. The mayor says he does not accept the apology. He's demanding that the minister resign immediately. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.
So I'm just going to go back to my my slides. So the reason I want to show that, there are many reasons, but just again, for time's sake, I'm just going to address one of the main points. So the main point is, as people, and I always find it interesting seeing people's reaction when he says, at the end of the day, can we just move on? And that is very, very significant for a health minister, obviously, to say. A health minister, by the way, who himself is a physician, because the reality, obviously, is that we can't just move on. And I can't go into all of the context of colonization and of genocide that explains why we can't just move on. But what I wanted to focus on, especially because I myself am part of the medical establishment, I'm a pediatrician, I'm a pediatric emergency physician. What I want to talk about is a systemic racism in healthcare. And so specifically in the book, I talk about medical colonialism, which is obviously not a new term. It's just the way I kind of decided to frame it is basically as a culture or ideology rooted in systemic anti-Indigenous racism that uses medical practices and policies to establish, maintain, and or advance a genocidal colonial project. And the argument I make in the book is basically that the medical establishment was not complicit in these things. The medical establishment played an active role in colonization, in genocide. And it's basically framed using the framework of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2 states 5 acts that if they're committed, qualify as genocide. And basically the entire section on medical colonialism is divided based on these 5 acts. So each chapter corresponds to one of these acts from Article 2. And because of time, again, I can't go through to give all the different examples from each of the different chapters, but and unfortunately, there are many, and my book is definitely not an exhaustive review of them. But I want to talk about the last one, which is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, because it ties back to the non-accompaniment rule and the campaign. The book on the left is a book that came out a few years ago, a couple of decades ago maybe, entitled A Long Way From Home, and basically talks about the forced evacuation, the mass evacuations of Inuit for tuberculosis in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. In these cases, kids were also evacuated. The average length, so they were evacuated and basically brought to, forcibly transferred is probably what should be used. So they're forcibly transferred to southern hospitals, hundreds if not thousands of kilometers away from home. Oftentimes they would be transferred between hospitals without even a day's notice. The children were typically alone. The average duration of a hospital stay at this time for these patients was about 18 months. But in some cases, there are children who stayed in these hospitals for up to 6-7 years, if not longer. And in many cases, kids did not return home. And so that was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then this on the picture on the right is an image from journalist work, Anne Panasuk for Radio-Canada. She basically has done several reports describing how Indigenous children from different communities, so Anishinaabe, Innu, Atikamekw, among others, have basically were transferred for medical care, medevac, airlifted, to other hospitals, and were basically disappeared into the medical system. This is in the the 50s, 60s, 70s. And she even says that, speaking specifically about the Atikamekw Nation in the 60s and 70s, basically there was every single family knew at least one child who had been disappeared. And so this obviously provides a continuity with the IVAC's non-accompaniment rule, because for Indigenous communities, not being allowed to accompany their kids meant that there was a very significant risk that they would never see their child again. And that was rooted in these policies that have been longstanding in Quebec healthcare and Canadian healthcare. And so one of the points I wanted to highlight is that this was allowed to happen because there's a medical culture that exists that allows it to happen. And so ultimately, the practice itself, whether it was intended to be, to impact Indigenous communities in Northern Quebec disproportionately or not, it's unclear. But the reality is that as of the 1990s and after that, when people and communities started demanding change, the fact that the government refused categorically multiple demands for change, at that point, it basically became an act of medical colonialism. One of the lines that has stuck with me from the time of the campaign was a pediatric resident had written me basically a few weeks after in support of the campaign. And she basically said, "We knew it was the rule, we knew it was awful, and yet we just kept going." And I put myself in that category as well. This was a practice that had been in place since I was a medical student, a resident, several years as staff, and we all just kept going. And so one of the points for the campaign, but also for this book, is basically so that we cannot anymore keep going. The reality, unfortunately, is in so many different ways. The healthcare system is structured in such a way that that these things keep happening, basically. And this was a media coverage from just a few months ago this year, of Emerge hospitals, Emerge staff basically playing a quote unquote game to guess the blood alcohol level of Indigenous patients coming into the Emerge. And this obviously has, this perpetuates age-old racist tropes, but these have significant impact on healthcare. This was the case of Brian Sinclair. People may be familiar. He was an Indigenous man who basically died in an emergency room in Winnipeg, after waiting for 34 hours in the waiting room, because Emerge staff thought that he was drunk, when in fact he was suffering from a urinary tract infection that basically went into his bloodstream, and then he developed sepsis. And so again, these prejudices, the racism that exists is significant and has significant consequences. In Montreal, this was the case of Kimberly Gload, and I'm sure Jessica and others could probably speak to the case more significantly. She was a Mi'kmaq woman who was living in Montreal, did not happen to have her Medicare card with her when she was not feeling well and came to the emergency department. And they basically told her that she would have to pay for treatment. And she, obviously, as most people, was not able to afford it. They told her it was something like $1,400. So she effectively was refused care, went home and died at home a few weeks later of presumed liver failure. And this, again, is a case that just happened a few years ago. And again, a result of all kinds of stereotypes and of systemic discrimination. And I bring it back because people often people will bring up the fact that I'm a pediatric emergency physician. The cases I talked about, whether it's Brian Sinclair or Kimberly Goad, are not kids. But the reality is that people are part of communities, and this is the image that this child is holding is that of Joyce Echaquan, and that's his mother. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, Joyce Echaquan died under brutal circumstances in Joliette Hospital at the end of September, after having to deal with racist treatment. But the consequences of her death, which were completely, there's no other better way to describe it than being brutal. The impacts are significant for her children, for her family, for her community, and for so many other communities that has impacts for generations. And so it's not enough, the criticism or whatnot of saying that, as a pediatrician, you should focus on kids. This is not a matter of just kids, because we're all part of communities that are impacted, and this medical violence in particular has to stop to break these cycles of violence. And so I'm just going to end on one of the lines from the book that comes back on a few occasions, is that inequalities in healthcare follow the fault lines of societal injustices. And so long as there are societal injustices, inequalities in healthcare will persist. And so I guess I would argue that for those of us in healthcare, but also those of us outside of it, it becomes that much more important to act in solidarity with demands for Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, land back, because those are the bigger drivers that actually impact on people's health. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Samir. I found it, first of all, really super interesting. And you pointed out so many, it was really, really concise on everything that we experience in the Indigenous community. What really struck me about the flights, and it kind of, because I work with a lot of Inuit girls in foster care, how child protective services like BACHA or the Département de Jeunesse, they will have escorts for them to go fly to see their families. Like, they spend an enormous amount of money surveilling them for them to just be able to see their actual family. And the reason why they're like living in Montreal is because they're going to school and so forth. So they're being constantly displaced. And then when they need help, like when they need actual medical services, so they're being surveilled. And so the whole idea that they couldn't have space on a plane makes absolutely no sense, and just shows how intentional it was on their part to deny someone that service, because they provide flights for and have escorts to surveil them, right? So thank you. Before I will move on to our next panelist, Wanda Gabriel. Hi, Wanda.
Hi.
How are you?
I don't know, Carrie, did you want to go? Because Carrie was posting that.
Do you want to go, Carrie?
Yeah, so my son's getting really, really impatient.
Sure.
So I think I'm going to need to go first.
Okay, go ahead, Carrie.
Carrie Martin, happy to have you here. We worked at the shelter together, so I'm sure you have plenty to talk about. Yeah, so I'll give it to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for changing the order around for me. I'm here alone with my 2-year-old, so I'm trying to juggle motherhood with with doing this panel. I'm currently working at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network as the Indigenous Women's Research Coordinator, so I haven't been doing any frontline work for about 3 years now. But yes, baby, Papa went to work. I do have about 18 years of frontline experience. So I worked a lot with Indigenous women for almost 2 decades in the front line. So I think what's already been said, I mean, we've heard so much already today about marginalization and anti-Indigenous racism, violence, the separation of children from families. I think when we're talking about medical colonialism, we already really know what the issues are. Like we keep seeing it in the media with Joyce. We see it in the different research projects. We see it over and over again on social media. And what's striking is that there's still denial from the political leaders that racism exists in our healthcare system. And so for the 18 years that I was working with Indigenous women, and being able to accompany them through this really complicated system, what really stood out was not just the frequency at which racism was taking place, but how blatant it was, and how healthcare professionals and other people like security or receptionists who are working within the healthcare system don't even try to cover up the racism anymore. And I think it's partly because we're not going outside yet. There is no consequence when these things happen. And even when people get up the courage and the energy to try to fight the system and to try to stand up for what's taken place, there's really no repercussions that take place. So the racism gets to continue to happen over and over. And then Indigenous people end up with diseases that are diagnosed at a later stage. And then from there, they get stereotyped as not caring about their health and about not taking care of themselves. And so it's just this vicious circle. And then nobody wants to, Indigenous people are not wanting to seek care or to go into the system at all. We already know about the different documents and the different policies that exist, like the UNDRIP, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the TRC Calls to Action, the Vieng Commission. Like, so much has been put down on paper to try to decolonize the system. To try to decolonize the system, but nothing is really happening and the changes are too slow. So I think we need to go beyond just trying to decolonize a system that doesn't work for Indigenous people to creating our own system, and to start focusing again on self-determination and start thinking about how Indigenous people can have a healthcare system by and for Indigenous people in Quebec. We're one of the only provinces without our own healthcare system, without our own healthcare center, not our own healthcare system, but our own center. And we shouldn't be asked to try to fix what's broken. We should be given the opportunity to have something that's all ours and that we can work with and develop get that out of your mouth, from the ground up. Sorry, he thinks he's funny. Yeah, so I have been working with a group of people, a very small group of people, since 2008 to try to open a health center here in Montreal. And the message that we keep receiving is that Indigenous people should just use the services that already exist. And despite the numerous reports and the studies and the anecdotal evidence that we give them that this system doesn't work, that it's not welcoming, it's not safe for Indigenous people, we're still told use what's already there, even though, you know, we have people saying things like, at the end of the day, why can't you just move on? So, you know, it's not a welcoming system. We've tried smaller initiatives to help decolonize the system. We've been working to try to get hospitals to open at least a smudge room within the hospitals. Every hospital has, every hospital has a chapel, and so why can't we have a smudge room within the hospital, right? But we can't even get, yeah, yes, we can't even get that in our hospital. You want to talk? Okay, talk. Yeah. Okay. And so I think that speaks volumes about where our system's at in terms of even wanting. Yes, baby. I think it speaks volumes about how they're not ready to make the changes that we need to decolonize the system. I'm really sorry about this. It must be really distracting for everybody to watch. But I think I'm going to end it there. I know that the panelists that are coming up are going to have so much more to add to that. But I guess my takeaway is that we don't need to necessarily just focus on decolonizing a system. Yes, that has to happen because there are specialized services that we'll always need within the city that probably we can't ever just have within our own healthcare system. But I think the main idea is that we need to have, yes, the right to control our own health and the right to have those services by and for Indigenous people. Yes. And again, I'm so sorry for.
It's okay. It's nice. It's nice to see your boy. They have lots of energy. It's awesome.
So much energy.
So much energy.
He's just competing for my attention. That's all.
So thank you so much for everything you said. And yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to hear everyone speak and maybe we can talk after. So our next, Wanda, are you ready?
Good evening, everybody. I'm ready. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Samir. Very interesting. I'm really excited about your book, Samir. I think it's going to be really important to bring it into the classroom. So I'm an assistant professor at McGill University in the School of Social Work. I've been there for 3 years now. And prior to that, I've been in practice doing healing work in my own community, as well as communities across Canada. I've been working with residential school survivors to transcend the trauma of genocide and the impact of residential school. And that time in doing the healing work is really a privileged time when people come together in circle to let go and to pass through the darkness of the emotional disruption from residential school. And so it's been a real sacred time working with residential school survivors and families when they let go of that darkness. It's really a transformative process and really amazing to see that happen when the healing happens. I wanted to pick up on what Carrie was saying about our right to control our own health services, and I want to do a little blurb for the Jage Health Center in Montreal that has been trying for years to establish our own health facility in Montreal, which is so needed. We've seen it through things that have been happening in Montreal. There is proper health services, and having our own health services in Montreal would go along the lines of our own self-determination and in sovereignty around our health and our land. It's so needed to have medical facility, because the medical system, as Samir is talking about, we're seeing medical colonization. And, the medical, echoing what Carrie is saying, trying to decolonize the medical system, it seems like an insurmountable task, because as we see in the, medical worldview, it's anchored in individualism. It's anchored in, sorry, my cats decided to come and be a pet. It's anchored in, a hierarchy. We see, doctors as the gods, and then there's layers of, people lower than. There's a disconnection. It's not about holistic health that we see in the medical system. It's about competition and authority. And in that authority, we see superiority. And in that superiority is that condescending and patronizing behaviors come out in the relationship with doctor and patient. And so, that reinforces the racism. I'm going to share my screen right now. I want to show a PowerPoint. Where is it now? Here. Okay, how come it's not showing? Hang on, let me redo this again. This is open, share screen. There we go. Share. And I wanted to talk about, in showing you this slide, is talking about healing of the human community. When we're talking about genocide, usually when we're hearing about genocide and the healing of genocide, we're directing it towards Indigenous people, but cultural genocide impacts all of society. And we need to break the denial. It's not only Indigenous people that need healing from genocide. We hear often, and Samir said it, Carrie said it, why can't these people move beyond it, beyond the past? It's happened and it's over. Well, that denial is also a part of the superiority thinking, in that genocide is also impacting the white part of society, and it needs healing. We need to move beyond the barriers that are present as a result of cultural genocide. So the guilt, the white guilt that we hear about, white privilege, the shame about the history, and the patronizing attitudes. Those are all things that need to be worked on. We need to have an open dialogue together about the realities of our relationships, the tensions and the underlying emotional currents that happen amongst professionals within our communities. And the disrespect between professionals. I'm talking about Indigenous professionals and professionals within the medical system. I've traveled to many medications, and sometimes at the airports, in the different, Shabugamu, Val-d'Or, I've heard professionals, medical professionals, social workers talking in the airport, and they talk about the clients openly, like there's no respect of privacy. And I've overheard intimate conversations about clients in the airport amongst the professionals. And, that doesn't happen. And the total disrespect on privacy and confidentiality for the patients and the clients. And so, we need to have these conversations about our practice, and also the tensions amongst Indigenous professionals and non-Indigenous professionals is this, the internalized superiority, internalized inferiority that happens when genocide happens, when we have a hierarchical system that tells us that the white race is superior. So what happens is internalized superiority. And so when we're working together, there's these tensions of, I know better, and the Indigenous not, making an Indigenous person feel not good enough. So these tensions come out, and this creates this miscommunication, misconceptions about the way we're working together. So they're things that need to be worked upon in healing the human community and dealing with cultural genocide. And when we look at healing, the impacts of healing in some of the healing work, when we look at decolonization, each aspect of the healing process brings back balance and self, connection to self, and interdependence in who we are and in our relationships. And so we become life thrivers instead of victims. And in becoming life thrivers, we find our balance. And working on the healing from Indigenous perspective is looking at the emotional release and dealing with the unresolved traumas or unresolved hurts. And so having emotional release, reestablishing emotional regulation. And we look at the mental component of the medicine wheel, getting an understanding of how genocide impacts family, individual, and community, provides people with a cognitive life raft to understand and to normalize some of the things that are happening when people have been through genocide. And we look at the spiritual component of healing, where we restore ritual and ceremony and connection to self, connection to spirit, connection to land, reestablishing that relationship with land, because part of who we are is so strongly connected to the land. So part of that spiritual healing is reestablishing connection to land, reestablishing a restored faith, as well as ceremony. And if we look at the physical aspect, we look at our reclaiming our culture, reclaiming our cultural identity. It talks about reclaiming who we are physically, and in that physical, reclaiming who we are physically is connecting to ceremony and connecting to dance and song and the relationship with land, and restoring faith and relationship with land is an all important part of the impacts of healing and understanding how we reclaim our identity and reclaim self in our cultural healing. And as we look at creating, spaces where people can feel safe, we need to talk about creating cultural safety. And what does cultural safety mean? It means looking at our relationships. It means looking at creating safety when we walk into these institutions where we can feel safe. Because one of the impacts of genocide is this mistrust of authority. So, reestablishing trust and safety is important. Looking at the relationship, understanding our relationships from a historical perspective, incorporating a trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed based practice, so that we're not judging people or putting people down, but rather looking at people where they're at and where they're coming from. And so incorporating these components into a process of decolonization are instrumental in bringing back balance to human relationships. So cultural safety and trauma-informed practice as part of the healing process. I think I'll leave it there and turn it over to Richard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wanda. Richard, it's your turn. You ready? Oh, you're on mute. Richard, you're on mute. Got it? You have to unmute yourself.
I was just flipping screens. I was looking at my remarks. So let me go back to that. I wrote some notes for myself. My name is Richard Budgell. I am an Inuk from Labrador. In May of this year, I was appointed as a professor of practice in the Department of Family Medicine. That's part of the Faculty of Medicine at McGill. I'm coming out of, I retired from a career of more than 30 years in the Canadian federal government. Last period of that was working here as the Executive Director of the Quebec Regional Office of the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. That's now part of Indigenous Services Canada. So I can say I've been in the belly of the beast, or in the belly of one of the beasts. And I'm going to talk a little bit, give some comparative kind of examples of stuff. So I'm really honored to have been asked to speak on this panel and talk a bit about the Samir's very impressive book. I found it very satisfying because I'm somebody who loves finding out about new things. Then immediately also, so much of what is discussed in some detail in the book is depressing and disturbing and enraging. The spur for the book was, as we've been talking about, Samir and others, the medical evacuation situation that was going on, which spurred the campaign of fighting for a handhold in 2018. Evacuations of children, who frequently Indigenous children, from the regions that they were coming from by air without the accompaniment of family members. Samir became a leader in the campaign against that practice, for which I am profoundly grateful. I was shocked to find out early on in the book that there have been previous efforts going back to the early 1990s and that those were ignored. And another revelation in the book that I found shocking was that this policy, there was no written policy banning the presence of caregivers on these medevac flights. It reminded me of an experience that I had in my old job within First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. So when I arrived in that office in late 2014, one of the things that I was told was that we, the federal government, should not be providing funding to the Cree Health Board for health matters. And because it was not allowed for the federal government to be providing funding under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which was signed in 1975. So I thought, okay, it seems unlikely to me that the EU and the Inuit would have agreed to something so disadvantageous. So I said to my staff in that office, okay, can you show me the clauses in the JBNQA? Give me the exact wording that says the federal government should not be providing funding for health matters. So there was a long pause. I came back to my staff a couple of weeks later, and the answer that I got was, oh, there is no such clause. So that was a bit surprising to me, to be honest, but I ended up calling this making policy on the basis of urban legend. And I imagine that decisions had probably been made in the past saying, no, we can't provide funding because it's not allowed under the JBNQA, which is a constitutionally protected treaty. I think this is on the same kind of level as what Samir talks about in the book, hidden curriculum, which is, in the training of medical professionals, where there is, what is overt and what is covert as well. And the covert is often more powerful than the overt. Point made in the book that I found really interesting and fundamentally true and definitional. The necessity for medevacs in this era, in the modern era, is exacerbated by the fact that there is no tertiary medical care available in Nunavik, and many medical technologies are less available than they could or should be. There's a total of 50 hospital beds in the 2 health facilities in Nunavik, in Quijano and Puvirnituk. In contrast, there is a 91-room residence here in Dorval. It's called Ulivik, and it provides a residence for people receiving medical care, outpatients receiving medical care, or family members who are accompanying them. That facility is frequently full, and there's also an overflow rooms rented from a hotel. So that kind of tells you where the priority is put in terms of the nature of medical care that people are getting, people from Nunavik are getting in this case. I found it interesting, and this was a lesson for me, that the same kind of preference existed for evacuations during the end of the tuberculosis epidemic in the 1940s and 1950s, despite recommendations that had come from physicians that there should be tuberculosis centers set up in Nunavik. That story is told in some detail in the book. There's description from published sources about the voyages of the medically equipped ship, the C.D. Howe, beginning in 1950, which played a huge role in the evacuation of Inuit with TB throughout what is now Nunavut and Nunavik. People were brought to TB hospitals in far southern Canada, many thousands of kilometers distant from where they were from, such as in Hamilton, Ontario, always without their consent, frequently without any kind of understanding about what was going on, because Inuktitut interpreters were not provided on the ship. I stopped to think about the kind of fear that would have been created in so many people, including children, who would already have been ill, and then to have them brought thousands of kilometers away from their homes and enduring strange medical treatments, and in many cases, and again, this is another shocking thing that I learned about in the book, forcibly restraining children to prevent their moving around, and sometimes that was done by putting children in full body casts. So this is among the horror stories that are in the book that Samir compiles: nutrition experiments on children in residential schools, bizarre skin grafting kinds of experiments. All of that taking place in a context where there's no clear or informed consent on the part of Indigenous children or their guardians. I found myself looking for signs of hope in the book. And then I read and you know, we've been discussing statements such as what Dr. Barrett, then the Minister of Health, was saying in terms of parents could not be allowed because of the danger of, you know, them being impaired, and you know, clearly this represented a systemic racism on his part. I liked the discussion in the conclusions in the book talking about the need for cultural safety for patients and reformulating training for medical professionals. Again, that point about hidden curriculum, I think, is very, very valid. And medical professionals putting themselves in positions of false neutrality, where they see themselves as not supposedly being able to take sides. And that kind of point is going to inform training that I will be giving in family medicine to medical professionals over the next couple of years. I think that the need for change in the healthcare system is much broader than just talking about training. Samir says in the book, and it's very apt, ultimately a decolonization approach means that Indigenous peoples are self-determining with respect to their health and healing systems, including to what extent they engage with the dominant medical paradigm. That statement is very much supported by conclusions of the Vienne Commission from 2019, which supported promoting self-determination and the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples in Quebec. In an article that I've written that's going to be published in the journal Droit et Liberté in December, I argue that self-determination should extend to a recognition and implementation of the Indigenous role in the governance of health systems that serve Indigenous communities and populations. To paraphrase, if you're not at the decision-making table, you might be on the menu. So for me, part of the restructuring that needs to happen is to ensure that Indigenous people throughout Quebec and Canada are meaningfully included in the governance, that is to say, the control of health systems. And I'm hearing what other presenters are saying about the need for Indigenous run and controlled health facilities that I completely agree with and support. I would also, though, add that this should include the let's call them mainstream health facilities, that there needs to be room in the governance of those facilities that are, you know, frequently massive facilities for decision making, for Indigenous people having a part in the decision making, in terms of the treatment of people in those facilities. I would say one of the sections that I loved of the book, just from the title, was History Matters. Indigenous people say this so much that sometimes I think we may seem like we're obsessed with the past to other people. But you know what we're doing is we're insisting that so much of what has happened in this hemisphere since the arrival of the incoming Europeans takes place in a context that has often been one of racism and comes from a desire on the part of majority populations to remove and diminish us. I'd like to thank Samir for the contribution of this book. He has given me and will give other people a great gift, that is by teaching us something. I appreciate his leadership in the campaign to end the barbaric medical evacuations without accompaniment for children. And he has made a contribution to improving the health and lives of many Indigenous children and their families. So I would say to Samir, thank you, Nakomik, and I will pass it along to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al. That was really, really interesting, and just made me think about so many things that I witnessed, like still about how even ethics of doctors and nurses when, for example, like when I accompany an Indigenous woman to have an abortion, how they're often forced to get a UTI, told that it's an obligation, and we find this out after the fact. When women give birth, if their children are being removed. Just like also, we didn't even get into everything that's come up with the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. There's just so many things that are just coming out and are just so horrific. So anyways, I just wanted to comment on that, like how it's something that's just like ongoing on a daily basis, these discriminations and being treated as second-class citizens, and also people not knowing their rights. They actually think that that's actually okay, that is the law, like being told it's a law to have to put like a UTI and you don't have that kind of autonomy. So I'd like to present Ellen Gabriel. I look forward to hear what you're saying. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Jessica. Kunwara so agwago gati pe kusne yuja tanu ugenya kanya kahaga ge do de tanu gana sada ge gena gari hato agata wa bagad hunzoni ti ditin wada de ne sangwai ditsu tanu ditin wada de ne ga tsansar so yera tanu oni ditin wada de ne ni ti insang hunzang wakatanu ni ti tasgarao gi tanu yung kwatara ni Gary Westa, kuno warado Samir, yung hota wasiado, si kanodos na hota wasiru. So, hi everybody. I wanted to first, before I started, is to say greetings to all the natural life forces and Mother Earth, the Creator, because when we start our discussions as Indigenous people, people of the Longhouse, we bring in all those elements into the discussion that don't have a voice in our discussions. And we have to keep them in mind when we are thinking about the decisions that we are making. And so Samir's book talks about, in a very indirect way, talks about the genocide of the people and genocide of the land that we see is happening today with climate change. Genocide, I think it's important for people to understand genocide. The TRC did not have a mandate to say outright that what happened with Indian residential school was genocide. They called it cultural genocide. But the Genocide Convention, which was created in 1948, was the very first convention, an international human rights treaty that was devoted exclusively to human rights. It was talking about the inherent dignity of a human being. It's talking about being valued, and Wanda and Richard and Samir have talked about it. Being valued and respected as a human being for your own sake, your own intrinsic humanity. And one of the things that we find in the Convention on Genocide is that in the preamble, a total disregard and contempt for human rights that Canada has given towards Indigenous people or people of color and transgender and different people who are considered minorities, but they should just be considered human beings. The foundation of a family is that freedom and justice of the world, that the rights of the child, which the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights talks about. Every child is entitled to, when they're growing up, they're entitled to special care and assistance, and that every child has a right to grow up in a healthy family life, in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And there's this old cliche that it takes a community to raise a child. Well, we're part of a bigger, broader community. And that community, part of that community has been disrespecting us since their ancestors arrived here over 500 years ago. And as Carrie mentioned, we know what the answers are. We have all the reports, and Samir talks about it. We have all the reports. We have all the solutions right there. We have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which talks about self-determination. And children have a right to self-determination, as we all do. So what does that mean? It has the right to, whether it's your spiritual, economic, physical, mental, all those things that make us human beings, a child has. And this has been disrespected. And I've been listening to Samir all week talk about his campaign. We joked about it earlier. I'm doing something on Samir, a special project. And this whole campaign was all about money. It cost too much to refurbish a plane. It cost too much. And then this whole foundation of what genocide is based on, which is racism, the other, this total domination over other human beings, which still exists in Quebec, it still exists in Canada, it still exists in the world, this domination. And I like one of the things, one of the people Samir quotes, who is Robin DiAngelo, and we talked at length about her the other day. And she talked about white privilege. And so, I'm entering into this scary domain of race. And when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about a group of people, and not all people. It's an elite group of people who are holding and clinging on as best they can to this sort of privilege that they have had for many, many generations over people of color, over Indigenous people, all for either economic reasons or just because they have a twisted mind, and if we were to really address those issues, the root causes of what has been going on and what Samir's book is talking about, as Robin DiAngelo says, it's like a house of cards. It's just going to fall and crumble, and they're barely, the cards are just barely touching each other right now because so many people are standing up and rising up. And in the 30 years that I have been doing human rights advocacy, I have seen a lot of real significant changes in what's in the area of human rights, in the area of people understanding what Indigenous people's human rights and self-determination means. But we have so much more to do, as we see with the death of Joyce Echaquan. And it takes me back to the beginning of the history of Canada, when they saw that the women had a lot of power and authority, and that we had really strong roles to play in the decision-making processes and the self-determination of our people traditionally. We've lost that now, but I'm talking about traditionally. And so when I see the example of medical colonialism in this aspect of what we're discussing about children or parents not being allowed to accompany their children, I think we need to go deeper and see that as a gender-based discrimination. That Indian residential school was attack on the family unit. And it was an attack upon our languages, and it was a way to control us so there would be more land dispossession. And so what we see is comments like Barrette as if we are a burden to society, when it's actually been the other way around. It has been settlers who have been a burden to us because we have been displaced. Our whole identity and our whole spiritual and mental well-being has been displaced by this box the colonizers put us in and tells us, and we, to extent, for many generations, we were supposed to accept the colonizers' version or definition of who we are as human beings. In our language, we say Ukwahuwe. Ukwahuwe just means the real human being. It's not talking about race. It's not talking about, so when I say Ukwahuwe and I'm talking about Richard and Inuit people, or I'm talking about Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and I say Ukwahuwe, that's all it means is a human being. And we have been so dehumanized that we don't see the extent that we have all been colonized, including settlers. So I want to also just highlight that we need to start thinking about the gender-based discrimination that exists throughout the policies of the Indian Act, that exists throughout the genocidal experience that we have. And this project that is continuing, this genocidal project that is continuing, I am worried. I am worried for the babies, you know, the little boy that we saw, Carrie's beautiful little boy playing. I'm worried about his children and his grandchildren and many coming afterwards, because it's not just a genocide against Indigenous people that we're talking about. And when I say the genocide against the earth, I have to explain myself, because I'm not talking about the fact that if we die as a species, the earth will die too. No, she's going to continue. It's the way that we want to dominate the land, and the way the colonizer has wanted to dominate us and the land is through us, to make us feel ashamed of who we are, to make us self-medicate so that we have the highest rates of addiction, we have the highest rates of suicide, and the government just puts band-aid solutions. We need, as everybody has said here, we need to start being self-determining about our own health. You know, the community that I come from has been fighting for land protection for over 300 years. And the worst ones, now we have internal colonization. We have those who are assimilated and colonized, cutting the pines. We have them threatening the women and talking very disrespectful to the women. And so it's like a wave, right? This genocidal wave, and how it's affecting us, and how some people just refuse to listen. We have our own people that are doing that. But when we talk about the solutions, this is what the people who have been on this panel have been talking about. And this is what a human rights-based approach is talking about. It's talking about that kindness and compassion, and the courage to have that compassion. Because to have compassion, you need to be able to have the ability to understand and say, I accept you as you are, that I accept you for being a human being. And it's really difficult. We are all flawed. We're all imperfect. We all have our own biases, but it's how we treat others, or how we understand each other's limitations, and even our own limitations. One of the things I think it's important to also remember is that when we think about, and Samir, you brought up a good point. You know, the death of Joyce Echaquan is going to resonate for so many generations. She was, I think, the first person after George Floyd during this pandemic that we witnessed dying before us, and nobody could do anything about it. This policy, or we'll say it was an unwritten policy, its foundation was racism. Its foundation was based upon something that happened hundreds of years ago, which was terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery based on religion. And a religion that today continues to, I guess, a religion of money. That's the new religion. A religion of money that cannot be satiated. And it's disturbing to see the amount of money and resources being thrown at denying Indigenous people their human rights. Whether it's people from here in Ganessadage, where government refuses to do anything about land dispossession or what's going on in our community with the marijuana trade, or whether it's lobster fishermen, whether it's 1492 Landback Lane, climate change in the north with Suiton, tar sands. The list goes on and on and on. How is that affecting the children? What do you think the people, the Mi'kmaq people and children who have witnessed the rage and the violence of their own families being attacked because they were trying to make a living? Or that what we see in the north, what's happening to the animals like the polar bears who cannot hunt or are dying because the ice floats are melting. They don't have that ability. You know, it hurts. It's not just human beings that we should care about, but this is all interconnected to the medical establishment. When I'm saying human rights are universal, they're interrelated, they're interconnected. And this is what we see part of medical colonialism's contribution to the genocidal project that is ongoing in Canada. I really want to thank Samir for what he did. And I asked him, like, Samir, why did you succeed where others failed? And he's very humble about this. And I don't think, Samir, you give yourself enough credit. Because he's, for him, it was like the families, and he acknowledges that, what he did, Indigenous people have been trying to do for decades. And this goes to the issue that it doesn't matter how much or how loud we yell, we will not be listened to unless the ordinary citizen, the ordinary Quebecois or Canadian gets involved in the issues of justice and social justice and freedom. When we talk about a revolution, we need to talk about the freedom inside that revolution. We need to be able to discuss the equality inside that revolution and the gender-based freedom and safety that is required for a real revolution to take place. Not just ousting a political party, but a real revolution that hits you in the heart and hits you in the mind, so that we don't have to fight about curriculum for nurses and doctors and other healthcare professionals. They will already have it before they even go for training. This is part of the revolution that we need, and in Ganyakeha, or it has the Mohawk language, we have something like 275 words that have to deal with the mind. And this is what this is about, right? This is about changing the mind. When you say something like that, you have a good mind. And there's different ways to say you have a really bad mind, which an elder told me, "Oh, that's not nice. You don't say those kinds of words," so I won't say them. But I think that this discussion that Samir has started, and that the Royal Commission started, the TRC started, and the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women started, and indeed the tragedy and murder of Joyce Echaquan started, needs to continue far beyond this. And I'm crossing my fingers that the pandemic will be over soon, so that we can see each other eye to eye, that we can see each other who's listening, and we can be able to hug again, and touch as human beings, because that social contact is so important. We all realize how important social contact is. What about the child that didn't have that when they were being flown down, right? Just like Indian residential school, when a child fell or was crying, they didn't have that person to hug them and to hold them. Well, we're big kids now. We're adults now. We still need that hugging and holding. And imagine a child who is powerless. This has to go into the history book. This has to remain part of the curriculum of this teachings that Samir has brought us. And I want to say what an honor it's been to have written the afterword, to be part of this book. It really was a great honor for me. So thank you everybody for listening. These are my words.
Thank you so much, Helen. So I think we're going to go to questions, because we're running a little bit after, but like to see what people have, any questions, and open it up. You can write in the chat. I have a question for whoever wants to answer while we wait. Just what really resonated is how we are complicit in these systems. Like when Samir was saying that he knew it was wrong, but not challenging those policies, or even to the point where taking things that were like, when people would say, oh, this is embedded in the law, and it wasn't, just, you know, taking that as like the truth. How do we like confront those? Like, I just find those behaviors really interesting because we all do them. And what it was the turning point where it's like, we need to take action. I guess it's more towards Samir. Like, I can no longer like work within this system that myself knowingly that this is happening, and I have to actively try to change that. Samir, or maybe Richard want to answer?
You have to, I don't know, have a level of not caring or not having a great deal of fear. I think, you know, I worked inside a, you know, huge bureaucracy for more than 3 decades. And I can't say that I always stood up. You know, I mean, I started my career like as a young person, of course, very junior, and it's harder to stand up in that kind of situation. But, you know, I aged and matured in that system. And I guess I would say I found it progressively easier because, I don't know, I lost my fear. But you are nevertheless part of the system. Regardless of your actions, you are part of the system if you're working in that kind of, you know, bureaucracy, for instance, and you have to acknowledge your role as part of it as well. You can't just pretend that you have nothing to do with what else is going on there, you know, on the part of actions of other people. So I would say it's hard. It's hard to stand up. And this is why I salute people who do, like Samir.
Yeah. We have a question. I'm a student at McGill. I was wondering if Samir and some of his colleagues and friends will be up for speaking to every single discipline, not simply medicine, about the implications of this work and our responsibility to support Indigenous relatives here towards the creation of the Jaggi Health Center. I'm a firm believer there is important work for non-Indigenous people to help in material ways. So.
I can try. Maybe I'll just, because I don't want to answer because I feel like I already talked too much. And so I'm hoping that Carrie and Ellen and Wanda and Richard can chime in. But very quickly, I guess, to answer this question, I mean, I think people, you know, we're being invited, different people are being invited to do different events in different contexts. So for sure, I think, I mean, I personally would be open to doing other events for different audiences, and I have been. But this kind of segues back into, Jessica, your question earlier. I guess there's a reason why I focused on the medical establishment in the book. I mean, there's one chapter where I talk more about social workers in the context of the 60s scoop and the millennium scoop and stuff like that. But I intentionally focused on the role of physicians because I'm a physician, and physicians, as Wanda mentioned, and clearly everyone knows, are at the top of the hierarchy that exists. And I struggle with the question that you raise of, you know, of our complicity and our active role in reproducing violence when we are working within the system. It's I think, a constant daily question. And I don't think I definitely don't have an answer or solution. I tend to sometimes see, and without wanting to be offensive to people who actually do frontline harm reduction work like you, Jessica, and others, but I kind of see the work that many of us who are aware of these issues and engaged for social justice, I kind of see our work within the healthcare system as being a harm reduction approach, but harm reduction in the sense that we're trying to mitigate the harm that the system is causing people. Because I feel like if we're not there and we're not speaking out about it and we're not actively confronting it, then it's just going to keep happening and continue to keep happening. And so I guess for me, my role that I saw in writing this book, and I wanted to be very careful and aware of not writing the stories of Indigenous children, of Indigenous communities, because that's not my story to tell. the story I wanted to tell is a story of the medical establishment and the violence that it inflicts and that it has inflicted, because that's a part of, that's my work. That is what I do. And I feel like that's one of the ways, perhaps imperfect, of coming to terms with working within system, is that the only way to be able to come to terms, I guess, is to be able to confront these systems, both on the inside and then on the outside, by supporting self-determination struggles and broader movements for social justice. I don't know if that helps answer the questions.
Yeah, definitely. I have another, I'm not sure if this is, I mean, it's an interesting comment. I'll just read it. Hi, thank you to everyone for sharing so generously your knowledge and experience. Hearing about children being violently separated sometimes for days from their families when they're important and urgent medical decisions to make, it makes me wonder how in those situations have been used by other institutions against those families, and particularly the DPG with the youth protection system afterwards. I mean, I think that also what you're saying, Samir, even from the outside or doing community work, how we constantly are doing harm reduction within harmful systems, you know, like taking risks, like working with the police, for example, you know, not knowing exactly what will happen, know that there's a lot of harm from those institutions, and how do you navigate that within? I think within is quite actually difficult, like when you're within a system more than when you're without, because you're not, if you do speak out, there's always a risk of being marginalized, or, you know, maybe being shut out of that and not being able to advocate on the everyday for your patients. Does anyone else have any other comments? Carrie or Wanda or Ellen? I mean, you also spoke so well, and it was just so interesting. Listen to all of you forever.
Well, I'll give it a try. Oh, go ahead, Ellen. Go ahead, cuz.
We'll take it on the road. No, you go first.
Okay, cuz, let me give it a try. You know, in breaking the complacency in the system, I think takes courage. You know, it takes moral courage. We need to be able to not stand by in silence, and to be able to point it out when we see it. Because, you know, no matter what kind of disruptive negative behavior is going on, those of us standing by always get this twinge of, oh, that doesn't feel good, right? It just happens in the middle of our soul that this doesn't feel right. And, you know, a lot of times we just bow our heads and turn away and look away and walk away. And we need to be able to say it out loud, that this doesn't feel right, you know, just to come from where we're coming from. This doesn't feel right. This feels really awkward. And just to put it out there, and then, you know, put it out, by putting it out there, putting the responsibility back on the person who's doing these behaviors, holding them accountable, you know, holding people accountable for their behavior. You know, part of the impact of genocide is that we don't hold accountability, that we don't hold people accountable, or we allow accountability not to be relevant. And so we have to be able to hold people accountable. And within that, I want to say too that what oppression does is create 3 rules. And I heard these rules over and over again with residential school survivors, in that we weren't allowed to talk. So the rule was don't talk. We weren't allowed to feel. You know, if we cry, they told us to stop crying, and we'll make you cry even harder. So don't feel, don't talk, don't feel, don't trust. So don't trust, you know, people who we entrusted, you know, in a power relation, in authority relationships in residential school. The teachers, you know, the support staff were all in positions of authority and positions of trust, and they all betrayed that trust. So, you know, those 3 rules, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, are what keeps oppression in place. And so we have to, I'm always saying, we got to break those rules, because those are the rules that are keeping things in place. And so we have to be able to find the courage to break those rules. I'll turn it over to Ellen. Nyawa.
Yeah, that's That's really important for people to know how we as Indigenous people feel amongst this monstrosity of bureaucracy. And I've been to a lot of meetings where there's so-called engagement sessions, not consultations, with 35 bureaucrats and 5 Indigenous people sitting in a room, and everybody's taking notes and nobody can answer. These are our concerns. This is what's happening. What can you answer this question? And none of them can, because they don't have the authority. So when there's a lack of political will, it's because the people who put these politicians into power are not doing their job in respecting human rights. So the bureaucratic culture that exists in Canada and all its provinces is the one that's holding back. We, as Indigenous people, as I said, our voices have been silenced for so long, but at the same time, we don't hold the purse strings to our money. You know, the money that we get from the royalties for the minerals and resources that have been taken off our land for many generations and centuries. We need people to get up off their chairs, to rise beside us, to put pressure on politicians to make changes. In Canada, we are living under one of the most racist existing law in the world, which is the Indian Act. And people talk about changing the Indian Act or getting rid of it. And getting rid of it should not mean assimilation. Getting rid of it should mean exactly what we've been talking about tonight, which is self-determination. But we need time to breathe. We need time to be able to heal, to be able to know what self-determination is, to know what it is to go back to the land, because our land bases are shrinking, so we lose part of ourselves. We need the time to be able to have some sort of peace. We have never been allowed to rest. Give us that chance and put pressure on your government to make the changes that we actually need, because protests don't seem to do it. It's a nice blip on the 6 o'clock news. We have been trying to do it. We have made complaints at the United Nations, and all Canada does is get their big PR machine out and say we're doing wonderful things for Indigenous peoples. Assimilation is what's the problem for us. We were losing our languages. We're losing our land. Those are two things that we need as Okwahu people to keep. And as long as as long as urban sprawl continues, as long as resource development is allowed to go unchecked, without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people, we can talk about all the policies that are unjust. But self-determination means land back. We want our land back. You can talk about in your medical profession all the stuff that you need to do and keep it strictly on science. I'm a human rights activist. I'm an activist for the environment. I come from a different place than all of you sitting here. I'm not an academic. I'm not a frontline worker. I'm a land defender. And as a land defender, I can tell you the government does not care about us. We are the disposable people. So it's up to you guys out there. You make the changes. You put pressure on your government. You put pressure on your MP to help us, and understand that it must be led by us. But you are by our side, arm in arm with us. So that's all I have to say. Now,
this is why I never go before Ellen. She's like, oh, so okay. So do we have time for one question? Just one more before, because I know we're going a little bit over, but I don't want to keep anyone. Is that okay? Yeah. So, hi, I'm a McGill neuroscience PhD student doing research at a hospital in Montreal. We really appreciate what all the panelists had to say. We've been confronting the administration at a research hospital in the effort to acknowledge and address racism and equity in healthcare settings, and often come up against an attitude of this doesn't apply to us, or we are doing well enough. Do you have any advice and approaches of working within these systems and dealing with people, especially those in administration or powerful roles, who don't want to admit that this needs to be addressed? And thank you again for the wonderful discussion. Does anyone have any advice how to go about the HR people at the ombudsman, at the hospital, the many people you have to talk to? Because they put all the systems together, like 4 hospitals and Sears and all these different things. You know. Does anyone want to answer or no?
Breaking the silence. People have to stop being silent. Speak it, say it. You see it, speak it. People have been silent for too long, and letting these behaviors continue to cause harm when the intention is not to cause harm. So speak it, bring it out over and over again, and use the system.
I agree with what Wanda is saying, and you might find that you are not alone, that you will have colleagues, other students, counterparts who agree with calling it out, but someone sometimes has to start. And there are institutional ways of doing that, and then there are more disruptive ways of doing that. And I'm no longer convinced that the institutional ways are necessarily the best. Sometimes a more disruptive way, and you can do this, without being horrible. But sometimes you got to maybe be a little disruptive about it.
I just want to add too, because this is something that I've noticed in my lifetime, is that governments are spending less and less on healthcare, and the staff are overburdened, overworked, and they're made to feel like they're supposed to be bionic, right, Samir? So I think that what people also need to examine and put also some effort into it is having government invest in the healthcare system, especially now during a pandemic when so many people are getting more and more mental health issues, especially the young people. There needs to be an investment in people. It's not just about investment for third parties and corporations and foreign investments to come into Canada and do resource development. It's about investing in the people that you do have in this country. And it's supporting the people who are providing healthcare so these things don't happen, and providing the best quality care. It means that you're also respecting the staff who are providing that care, because it's really important to remember that they're human beings too. The system, this is such a multi-leveled discussion, but I think that you need to have more doctors, more nurses, more people who care, and they can't do that when they're overstressed and overworked. So thank you.
Okay, so we're getting so many great comments, how awesome it was. I thought it was a really, really inspiring, sad, not an easy subject to talk about, but really, really inspiring. All of you went by so fast. And just going to say, these are the places where you can purchase Fighting for a Handhold. And I want to thank you again, Samir, for inviting me to moderate this panel and all the guests. And look forward to more action to be taken. No more commissions. Just like now, it just really needs to be action. There's just no excuses. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to Jessica, everybody out there. Richard, nice to meet you.
Thank you, everybody. It's great. Thank you, Samir. That was awesome.
Thank you.
All of you.
Great. Are you all pleased, Samir? You good? Yeah. People are listening still. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry.